Okay, so hello everyone, welcome to this event. My name is Claire Lefort. I'm the director of the Parks Institute for the Study of Jewish non-Jewish Relations here at the University of Southampton. We are very happy to host this particular seminar. It is the last research seminar of this academic year, and it is special because it is organized as part of the ongoing online course on complicating the narratives of the Kindertransport, which enters its third and final week. So we have also just launched a virtual exhibition, which shows more than 150 documents digitized from the special collections and also lots of pedagogical resources for the course. So Kindertransport is a very important theme for the Parks Institute, and we are very happy to have this event tonight and to be hearing about the experiences of Jewish and Bosnian child refugees, so Hanna Zack Miley and Smajo Bešo in conversation. I am very grateful to Chad McDonald and Amy Williams for putting together this event and for chairing it. So Chad is a honorary fellow at the Parks Institute, an academic and study skills tutor for arts and humanities at Manchester Metropolitan University. He also did his PhD with Tony Kushner. He is also the curator of the award-winning traveling exhibition James Parks and the Age of Intolerance, which has visited Christian, Jewish, and civic venues throughout Britain. Amy is currently writing her first book on the Kindertransport for Mitterdeutscher Verlag, and she is co-authoring a book with Bill Niven on the Kindertransport for Yale University Press. She has curated also several traveling exhibitions focusing on the Kindertransport. So thank you to both of you. And before I hand over to you, I wanted just to add a few words on the housekeeping. So you are all welcome to keep your cameras on during the talk. You can choose whether you want to watch this webinar in the gallery view or speaker views. There is a little function in the right top corner view, but please keep your microphone off during the talk. And if you have any questions, please put them in the chat or raise your hand at the end. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much, Claire, for that introduction. So tonight, we're going to hear from 4 speakers alongside myself and Amy. So we're going to hear from Hanna Zack Miley and Smajo Bešo. They will introduce their stories to us throughout this evening. But just for the briefest of introduction to them, Hanna Zack Miley came to Britain in July 1939 on the Kindertransport when she was aged 7 years old. And Smajo Bešo came to Britain with his family when he was 9 years old as refugees from the war in Bosnia, where Muslims had been the victims of ethnic cleansing and genocide. So as part of this evening, we will have about 40 minutes of Hanna and Smajo in conversation between themselves, discussing their own stories and also the connections that they've found between their stories as well. After that 40 minutes, we'll bring in Bill Niven, who is Professor Emeritus of Contemporary German History at Nottingham Trent University. And Bill will particularly pick up the theme of reconciliation. And then we're going to hand over to Caroline Slifkin, who is an artist and a Holocaust educator who specializes in teaching about the Holocaust through Holocaust art. And she'll be talking about her work and her projects with Amy on the Kindertransport and future projects as well, connecting Hanna and Smajo's story. But before we get to that, Amy is going to open up the evening by providing a bit of context about why we decided to put this talk on and kind of where it came from and about the wider connections between the Kindertransport and Bosnian genocide. So I'm going to hand over to Amy now.
Thanks, Chad, and thanks, Claire. I'm going to try and keep this brief because we obviously want to hear from the speakers. But yeah, as Chad said, it's just to give some wider context. And yes, Smajo and Hanna are connected to this story, but there are other Kinder and other Bosnian refugees who are as well. So we just kind of want to highlight their stories. So yeah, some of you might be wondering how the Kindertransport and the Bosnian genocide are connected to one another. We'll shortly hear from Hanna and Smajo. Both are survivors of different genocides, and they have come together today to share their stories with us. We often hear survivors give individual talks about their experiences, but more recently, the stories of survivors are starting to be discussed in relation to one another at the same time and on the same platforms. This might be because of the interconnectedness of Holocaust Memorial Day. On this day, we're encouraged to think about how many other horrific genocides have taken place since the Holocaust. It is particularly the case in Britain that the Bosnian genocide has been taken into the framework of remembrance, and in doing so, it has become more visible. It is through the incredible work of survivors in recounting their different experiences of racism that we also learn that their stories of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia can be seen in relation and not in opposition. As in the case with Hanna and Smajo, some survivors also reach out to one another via social media to learn about other stories which have a deep connection with their own. So we have commemorative and educational connections, but we also have cultural, personal, and charitable ones. Some of you might be aware of a recent BBC TV series called Saved by a Stranger. This show directly connected the rescue of Jewish refugee children in 1939 to the rescue of Bosnian refugee children in the early 1990s. What was really interesting about this programme was that it stressed our historical tradition of helping refugees and simple, often not so simple, acts of kindness. But it also challenged the positive view of rescue because it reflected upon doors closing to refugees in the present. Now, I'm sure you're all aware that the Kindertransport has been compared to, or rather, parallels have been drawn between the Kindertransports and other groups of children. For example, some of you might be aware of the connections between the Kindertransport and the Basque children, Los Niños, British evacuee children, and more recently, Syrian refugee children. But what our event today aims to address is why these connections between the Kindertransport and the Bosnian genocide are taking place now. And what better way to unpick this complex story than by inviting Hanna and Smajo to speak to this topic? What I find most striking about these recent connections, and of course Hanna and Smajo's stories, is that the Kinder and Bosnian refugees were making these connections at the time and not some 20 years after the genocide in Bosnia. We seem to have arrived very late, or rather cultural representations which are in the public sphere were slow to catch up with the survivors. For example, Hans Lichtenstein was a Kindertransport survivor from Berlin. He was awarded an MBE for his work in taking medicine to Bosnia. Jonathan Lichtenstein, who is Hans's son, recently wrote a must-read book about his travels with his father to retrace his Kindertransport journey. Jonathan's book is called The Berlin Shadow, and specifically on pages 282 and 283, you can read about how Hans acted when he saw suffering. Another story we must share with you is of Tamara and Aaron Shak's dear mother, Maria, who later became Miriam. Maria came from Istria, Croatia. Her father was a coal miner and her mother was a trader. She had two brothers and one sister. The family came from a history of exile, as hundreds of years before they'd fled Montenegro for Croatia. Maria was about 9 or 10 when her father died in a mining accident. And then in 1943 and 1944, her mother was murdered by partisans. So she was orphaned with 3 young siblings to take care of. Sadly, they were separated from one another when they were placed in orphanages. When Maria was studying languages at Zagreb University, an opportunity arose to come to Britain. Her best friend's father was connected to the British consulate. Maria was terribly unhappy in Croatia and wanted to leave for London. And in 1955, she arrived. Not long after, she met Fred Barshak, a Kindertransport survivor from Vienna. A courtship began and Maria converted to Judaism. Both shared with one another their common loss. They both lost their parents at a very early age. Because of their compassionate spirits, they acted in July-August of 1991 to help a friend in need. They watched and read all the news about Bosnia in the 1990s. Their friend was a colonel in the Croatian Air Force and was to be arrested by Serb forces when he wrote to the couple to take in their son, which of course they did with open arms. He stayed with them for a year. Now, Tamara and Aaron have both travelled back to Croatia and Austria with their parents. The family speak 13 languages between them, and Tamara and Aaron have both helped Iranian refugees find housing. They both told me that they have a duty to help refugees. So the final story I want to share with you is the role of the British Red Cross. This charity helped in both cases. In the 1940s, the Red Cross was a lifeline for the Kinder and their parents, who were not able to, in some cases, follow their beloved children to safety. It was through the Red Cross that their families were able to send letters and telegrams to one another. While these eventually came to a halt as routes were cut off, the Red Cross stepped in after the Second World War to reunite families. The Red Cross played a similar role during the Bosnian Genocide, and I'm sure Smajo can talk to you about this if anybody has any questions later on. So before I hand over to Hanna and Smajo, I just briefly want to say that we wanted to do this talk to draw attention to the international as well as national and local importance of raising the awareness of the Kindertransport and the Bosnian Genocide. So yeah, I think this is a really good point to bring Hanna and Smajo in to give an overview of their stories, and then we're going to go through some questions and some prompts for them to answer for the next part of the talk. So over to you.
Would you like me to tell my story now?
Yes, please, Hanna. Thank you.
You know, I'm 89, so it's an awfully long story. And so I'm going to try and make it really brief and share some highlights. I was born in Germany on the 18th of February, 1932. That was 11 months before Hitler seized power. I was an only child, and my first memories are saturated with the love of my elderly parents. We were Jews, and we lived in Gmünd near the Belgian border. Gmünd is actually one of the little towns that has just been devastated by flooding. You may have seen it even on the news. We were also noted at that time, at the time of my birth and the years after, as the hosts for one of Hitler's castles. Vogelsang was built on a hill above our small spa town. And the purpose of the castle was to form young German virile men into racists. They were to be educated in racism. And my father was galvanized to find me a place on the Kindertransport after Kristallnacht. That was November the 9th, 1938. I was 6 years old. That was the night our synagogue was destroyed. I can remember even now the moment when I made the decision to suppress my pain, to suppress my emotions. I was sitting alone among all the other children in our train in the corner of a compartment, taking me away from danger and taking me away from all that was secure. I took on a new identity in Coventry, England. I embraced a new language and a new culture. And there was no one to understand or help a child with their loss. Years later, I was a teacher in Sussex when I became fully aware of the turmoil within. Until that point, I had tried to suppress it, and that didn't work anymore. I had actually reached the limit of my endurance when I had a personal encounter with God, and I experienced the reality of his forgiveness. What was he forgiving me for? What was he freeing me from? He was delivering me from my anger, my hatred, and bitterness. It was towards Germans and what they'd done to me and what they'd done to us. But that was the beginning of a journey into forgiveness and reconciliation with my German past. And actually, that journey still continues today. It's ongoing. I'm still a traveler on that road. But, you know, going back to that early time, that first freeing of the bonds that were holding me, you know, it's one thing to forgive at a distance. But it was only when I started to return to Germany, going to the places that bore bitter memories, and actually encountered Germans who shared with me the shame that they carried, that was their inheritance from their ancestors. And when I could tell them about my personal encounter with forgiveness and my own healing, how my own healing had taken root, that exchange was kind of freeing for them, but it also took me deeper into a release from the past. In the spring of 2010, with my husband and 8 close friends, I followed my parents on their last journey from Gmünd. They ended their journey in Chelmno, Poland, and that is where they were gassed in the back of a grey truck. Their bodies were incinerated in the forest, and their ashes mingled with all the other unknown individual human beings. When I prayed at the actual place where they stepped into the truck, and we as a group of 10 said Kaddish at the exact location in the forest of the incinerator, the painful memories and the mourning for my dear ones at that moment, I reconnected with my Jewish identity.
Thank you very much, Hanna, for sharing your story with us. I'm just going to hand over to Smajo now to share his.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Hanna. Yeah, I mean, usually when I do my talks as well, I'm an emotional person and I do get emotional and I'm not embarrassed about that. And I think every time I hear Hanna speak, every time I learn something new, and I feel like we're on this journey together. We're just at different stages, and I'm really honored to be here today. And, you know, thank you to all of you for organizing this. When I usually share my story, I get about 45 minutes and I always go way over that. So I'm going to try as quickly as I can to get it all down into a couple of minutes. I came to the UK in July of 1994 with my mother, my brother and sister, and we came as refugees as part of a UK government programme in collaboration with international humanitarian agencies such as the Red Cross. And we joined my father, who had arrived several months earlier from a Croatian concentration camp. Coming to the UK was incredibly difficult, but we met some of the most compassionate, amazing people in the Northeast that campaigned and that helped to bring us here, that helped us to settle. And I'm sure as we discussed this evening, I'm sure I'll have an opportunity to share some of those stories. And we left everyone and everything behind in Bosnia. And the first time we left our home, my parents locked up our house and we escaped through the mountains. I still have their key here in Newcastle because my parents literally just designed and built their own home, and we had just moved into it, and we had lived in it for about 6 months before the war started. And Bosnia was this amazing, incredible country, and very much a modern European country as well. And my family is Muslim, but in my family, we also had Catholics, we had Orthodox Christians, we had Jews, we had atheists, and Christmas and Easter and all these things, they were just a completely normal part of my childhood because we respected those differences. And I always say it's not like that we thought we were all the same. In Bosnia, we actually understood that we were different, but we valued those differences. And things quickly changed. And for me as a child, that felt like it happened overnight, but obviously I was completely unaware of things happening on in the background. And for maybe 10 years or even longer, leading up to the start of the war, you know, there was things happening politically and that tension was there. By the spring of 1992, and the point that we left our home for the first time, in the first 9 months of war, we moved more than 14 times. And each time we didn't really know where we were going, what we'd find, but we just had to keep moving to survive. It was as simple as that. And at times we lived just in the open, in ruins, and we had to get by. My father, my uncles, my cousins, they all became soldiers overnight, and they weren't. My dad worked in a factory before the war. He definitely wasn't a soldier. About a year into the war, my dad was taken away. One day, he was just gone. We didn't know what had happened to him. We heard the most awful rumors that all the men, so in my hometown of Stolac, all the Bosnian Muslim men were arrested by the Croatian army on the 1st of July, 1993. And we heard the most awful rumors that they were all killed and slaughtered, that the same thing would happen to us. We remained behind for more than a month before women and children were rounded up, taken to collection centers where my mom was actually forced to sign this document to say that she was given everything up for safekeeping. So everything that my parents had, and they confiscated, you know, gold, money, anything basically that was of any value. And we were loaded onto cattle trucks, driven to near Bosnian government controlled territory, and then just forced to march again, where I saw some of the most awful things as a little boy. And one thing that I vividly remember as we were walking in this crowd, and there was elderly sitting beside the road, unable to walk anymore, and there was, you know, belongings scattered across the road. And my sister would be just ahead of us, I would be on the left, and my brother would be on the right. And I remember my mom would hold on to us really, really tight. And I remember at one point stepping over something which I thought was a pile of clothes with a full mattress over it. And as I stepped over it, I just felt something hard underneath my feet. I could feel something different. And I looked to the side, and it was the body of an old man. And I knew that in that moment, I knew my granddad was somewhere there. Like, I knew he was in the crowd. I knew my grandmother was somewhere there. And I just remember thinking, you know, has he got the energy? Has he got the strength to keep moving? So after weeks of living in ruins, barely surviving, we actually settled in a town called Mostar. And Mostar was a ghetto, essentially, surrounded by the Serbian army on one side, Croatian army on the other. And again, similar strategies to the Nazis. You know, you bomb and shell people, and if that doesn't kill them, well, then disease and starvation will. But we were lucky, and we actually managed to make it to my auntie's sister's house. And my mom and my sister, they were so incredibly creative and managed to put food on the table every single day. We were hungry, we were literally starving, but we had something every single day. You know, they would use grass to make pies, they would use chicken feed to make bread, and the most awful, awful brown bread. When I mention it, I feel like I can still taste it. It's awful, but that kept us going. We eventually found out through, again, the Red Cross. We started getting letters, and my dad was actually alive. He was in a concentration camp alongside all of my male relatives. And we experienced awful things in Mostar, again, which I can go into in more detail later on. But we were literally shelled every single day. Thousands of bombs and shells would be falling to Mostar daily. Mostar city center, like a small, very small geographic area, something like 80% of the city center was completely destroyed. From there, when my dad was actually brought to the UK as part of that program, again, it was the amazing people of the Northeast that actually campaigned, that actually helped. The local MP, Jim Cousins, I've got a letter where he describes my dad and myself and my mum and my brother and sister as constituents in April of 1994. I didn't even know where Newcastle was. And this is someone describing us as constituents. I mean, how incredible is that? The journey to the UK again took a month. We spent a month in a refugee camp in Croatia. We had to make a quick decision. They literally gave us 2 hours. They said, do you want to leave? My grandparents were reliant on my mom. The war was still going on. Srebrenica happened a year after this. Coming to Newcastle was absolutely amazing, seeing my dad for the first time well after a year. I had blonde hair when he left, and then I came to Newcastle, I had hair like this. He actually had more hair, came to Newcastle and he was bald. But again, Newcastle was absolutely amazing, and we had so many amazing people helping us. And again, I'll go into all of that later on. In terms of where I am on the journey of healing and peace, and I feel like my journey is very much at an early stage, even though it started back in January of 1994 in a particular moment, which I'll go into later on, but it's still in an early stage, and it's taken a lot of hard work and effort from my grandparents, from my parents, to remind us about the importance of not hating, the importance of seeking justice rather than revenge. And as I said, when I share my story, it's not an obituary to the past. It's something that's very much real, something that's very much in my present, and it's ongoing, and it will be in my future. So the UK has been incredible to me and my family, and I think we're very grateful to be here.
Thank you both for I know that was really difficult to sum up your stories because they're so complex, and yeah, like you said, there's so much you could talk about here, but just to kind of pick into things in a bit more detail now, you as you were saying, you've both engaged with your past, but at different times you're at different places. I'm wondering what you've learned from one another in sharing your stories. Hanna, you went to Bosnia in the 90s, and Smajo, you speak with Holocaust survivors. I don't know if you wanted to speak to that.
Yeah, you know, I'm kind of amazed at the kind of circles of our lives, because it was true in the 90s. I went with my husband and some friends, and we visited Mostar, and the things that Smajo is talking about. Mostar Center had these very beautiful buildings, and we arrived sometime after the horrors, and the buildings it was rubble. And, you know, that was a while back. And now my encounters with Smajo have really touched me very deeply. And I think one of the big things for me is the way we have an understanding because of our common experience. And so I feel I have been so enriched to hear his take and how his family dealt with all the injustice, and it's an ongoing thing. And I'm very inspired by what he's doing, talking about it in the northeast of England, but also going back to Bosnia. But I think the biggest deal is having someone who really understands your story. I think a big takeaway for me is his empathetic understanding of my story and the affirmation of that and how his story affects me. I think child refugees particularly have a great need to have somebody who's really interested to hear. I think indifference is the biggest burden, and it's like adding to the pain. So it's been very redemptive to have these Zoom encounters with Smajo.
For me personally, I've been actively telling my story now for about 6 years, but really I think when I started uni, that's when I started thinking about Bosnia in a bit more detail. And I've had the honor of speaking in schools and events with Holocaust survivors. And in particular, it was one chap called Martin Stern, which some of you might know. And it was just 2 years ago, I think. It was a school in the Northeast. I think 3 years ago. Corona has thrown off my timeline. And that was the first time I obviously heard about him, and I've listened to his story online. But being there in person, and we were speaking to 90, it was year 9 history students, listening to his story and the way he told it and how captivated those kids were, and the way he managed to put a face to history and humanize and personalize history was incredible. And honestly, it had the biggest impact on me. And we had a brief chat afterwards. I mean, we could have chatted the whole day, but he had to go, unfortunately, and I had to go back to work. But listening to some of his experiences was amazing. But then this project with Hanna, it's not only that I'm listening to her speak, but then I can pick her brain about things. And she's able to explain things to me that I've been wondering, and because every time I tell my story, I feel like I'm still piecing it back together, and I'm still putting things together, and I'm still reacting. And I feel like actually I've learned so much through the process of meeting up with Hanna over the last few weeks and thinking about and listening to how she's been able to react on her experiences. And it's given me so much food for thought. Honestly, I feel incredibly honored, because one of my sort of philosophies is the best way we teach about genocide and these awful things is by humanizing and putting a face to history, by humanizing statistics, by humanizing documents, by humanizing numbers and so on. And for me, personally, I use my story as a peace building tool. That's how I would describe it. I started telling my story as a way of getting justice for myself and for my family, but I quickly realized actually that it's more than that. And I think one of the best ways, which is what Hanna, I think, was saying as well, one of the best ways in building peace is actually for people to be able to tell their story and for their story to be heard and acknowledged. And I completely agree with Hanna there. I think someone hearing your story, that's incredible. And I always make the point that the story always belongs to the person that's telling it, as well as the people that are listening. And then what do we do with that story? Because for me, remembering and paying respect to the past, that's very, very important. But what do we then do with that? And it's about action. So how do we take this forward? How do we use these stories to react to the world around us? And as I said, when I listen to Martin Stern and other Holocaust survivors that I've had the honor of meeting, and this experience with Hanna, I'm constantly telling myself, right, how do I use this incredible information, the incredible things that she's telling me? How do I actually use it in everyday life to improve my life and the life of people around me? So for me, it's been an incredible, incredible experience.
Oh, thank you for your answers. I think it'd be really interesting to hear from the audience maybe later on. What are they going to take away from this talk? how are they inspired? A question to you both now as well. I'm going to start with you, Hanna. Hanna, how do you see your role in America compared to Germany? And Smajo, a similar question. How do you see your role in Britain compared to Bosnia? If Hanna wants to start.
Well, in the last years, my husband and I spent many months in Germany, and it was a very deep reconnect with the culture and where people are now, whether we had public meetings and then really a lot of private conversations. And here in the States, there have been quite a few opportunities to speak publicly. But there is a vast difference between the two, because I think in Germany, there is still very much the bearing of the shame of the past. And both in public and especially in private, one of my deepest experiences, and very emotional, is to encounter descendants of perpetrators, people whose grandfather, great-grandfather actually were very involved in the whole genocide, and to have them open their hearts and share the enormous guilt and shame they are actually carrying. I mean, isn't that an amazing thing? These people in history, in the past, in their family, did terrible things, and now their descendants are kind of under a shadow. So I think in Germany, the big thing for me, and it's actually this enormous healing that takes place within that person and me, is for me to encounter them as a Jew who has experienced the effects of that hatred and the objectifying and making those Jews other, and the bad things, physical things that happened, to kind of hear that German descendant and to embrace them. And that, I think, is one of the most treasured experiences that I have, is to experience something very beautiful within me, but observe it in their person.
I think for me, and I'll start with Bosnia now, and this is the first time I've visited in 2 years, and I'm actually in Mostar now. I think the difference in Bosnia, it's not the descendants of the people that did these awful things, it's the actual perpetrators themselves. And every time I go back to Mostar and every time I go back to Stolac, to my hometown, it is like walking around one large crime scene. And I'm here visiting family, but also doing research. And there are times when I literally find myself and members of my family in the research itself. You know, the document that I said at the start that my mom was forced to sign in 1993 to say she was giving everything up for safekeeping, I found that very document. I found documents with my dad's names and uncles and so on from the concentration camp. So I think that's, for me, that's the biggest difference, because it's very difficult to talk about, for me personally, to talk about justice. Yes, we've had people like Mladic and Karadzic convicted, and again, Karadzic is actually serving his sentence in the UK, which is another thing that I think is amazing. But it's taken, what, 26, 27 years to bring those people to justice. How many mothers have passed away without actually seeing any justice? And unfortunately, the foot soldiers, because genocide, the systematic murder and rape of thousands and thousands and thousands of people, that's not done by a small group of individuals. That's a highly sophisticated system in place involving many, many, many people. And unfortunately, the people that pulled the triggers, the people that were doing these things, they're very much still living in the same communities that they once terrorized. My auntie was killed by she was killed by the Croatian army. It was the HVO, and we know his name. We know that he actually lives in Split, and Split is actually in Croatia. Croatia's in the EU. We know his name. We know he's got a family of his own. We know, and he's living freely. Probably took advantage of freedom of movement. You know, I can get a flight from Newcastle directly to Split. Maybe he's come the other way and visited Newcastle. I don't know. But it's incredibly difficult to rebuild your life when the people that committed these awful atrocities are there. Now, for me personally, it's easier. And it's far easier because I visit once or twice a year and I can detach myself from that. But the first thing that I notice when I come to Mostar, I see Croatian fascist flags everywhere. There are street named after Croatian fascists, Nazis from the Second World War. There are symbols, fascist symbols everywhere, and you can't escape it. And every time I come back, you kind of relive that trauma. It takes you time to reposition yourself within that. But as I said, for me, it's far easier to do that, and I can distance myself because I'm only there for a limited time. But my uncles, cousins, one of my cousins was 17. He was tortured and beaten by his neighbors. And he still lives amongst those same neighbors. My uncle, one of my dad's brothers, who went through the most inhumane torture for over a year, the stuff that they did to him, I literally, like, how do people even come up with things like that? I'll tell you one thing, I won't go into detail, I promise, but they would heat up needles and stick them underneath his fingernails. Literally the most inhumane things. He still sees the people that did these things for him. A couple of years ago, he called out an electrician, and the electrician was one of the men that took him away to the camp. So it's incredibly difficult. But again, for me, it's easier. I live in the UK. I can distance myself. The UK is the only country after Bosnia that has an official Bosnian Genocide Memorial Day. And as I said, I've been sharing my story for about 6 years now actively, and I speak up and down the country. And yes, I do it for Bosnia, but I also do it for the UK because this is where I've spent most of my life. This is where my nieces and nephews were born. And as I said, I use my story as a peacemaking tool. That's my aim in life. But my experience of doing that in Bosnia and the UK is completely different.
Thank you again for those really, really deep thought through answers. Thank you. Just slightly moving in another direction, Hanna, you've had your book published, and Smajo, you're in the process of nearly finishing yours and writing. And I suppose, can you tell us about that process? Are there similarities there? And I suppose why you tell your stories, why you want to put your stories across in this particular form?
You know, I was a very reluctant writer. It was for many years, people said, you should tell your story, write it. And I always blocked out what they said. But amazingly enough, it was a German in Gmünd at a special moment in time that I remember. We were walking across a bridge and this German friend, Gerda, said to me, why don't you write your story? And I can't explain why, but she kind of pushed me over the edge. You know, like I was standing on the edge so long, hesitating, and she pushed me into the water. And looking back, I think the book caused me to really delve deeply into my story and the social circumstances around it. And I did so much research. I mean, it took years and years. And some of the journeys that I took, even the one that I mentioned going to Chumno where my parents died, I was in the process of writing the book, and I'm very amazed at the timing, because as I was writing, I was thinking back to the people I'd met in Gmünd who'd actually met my parents. You see, I didn't know much about my parents. I didn't have any contact with them after the age of 7. And I had this deep yearning to know their personality and their character. Who were they? What were they like? How did other people see them? And I met especially 2 people who had been actually teenagers and had known my parents. And they were very intertwined with the writing of the book, because they gave me something of the personality of my parents in their stories. And the book, as I wrote it, I had different motivations. One of them was to tell the truth about what happened. I was very aware of Holocaust deniers. And so I went overboard on confirming the facts, the documented facts about what happened. But then I also discovered what I was doing in writing it was reconnecting with my parents, telling their story and honoring them and grieving them. Because, you know, in the blockout of my emotions that was released when I encountered God, I had also suppressed memories of my parents. So now I was on this overdrive of connecting with them. And the book was a form of a relationship that was developing with them. And I think one of the greatest joys in the whole process of writing, I mean, it was very hard and very difficult, and I procrastinated no end. But looking back, one of the greatest joys about it is the fact that it was translated into German by a very good translator, so it's very accessible. So I think one of the greatest fulfillments for me is that my story is available for German people to read.
I think we had very similar aims and goals with writing our books. For me, that process is still ongoing. It's been nearly 3 years. It's coming up to 3 years in January since I've been writing my book with a very close colleague and friend. It's been incredibly tiring. It's been incredibly draining. And there was times when I had incredibly draining flashbacks, and there would be times when we'd have to stop and we'd have to pause. But I was driven by, I think, similar aims. I wanted to tell the truth, because what we've had in Bosnia, although it's one of the most well documented recent genocides, it's still one of the least known genocides out there. So there's been so much, or basically the last 20, nearly 30 years, it's allowed fascists to completely hijack the narrative of what happened in Bosnia. And for me, that was important, especially my mother teaching us from an early age, actually seek justice rather than revenge. So I always had this desire from an early childhood to actually do this. And even when I was at school, I would write little autobiographies, and I've still got copies of all of those. I'm a hoarder. I keep random things like that, but I've got all these documents there. But I think what prevented me from doing that was the fear. Would I be able to do this justice? Because it wasn't just for me. It was for my parents. It was for all my relatives. It was for everyone in Bosnia. And when I started doing it, reluctantly, it did help me in a similar way to what Hanna was saying, connect with members of my family that were killed, that weren't there with us anymore. And I spent a lot of time speaking to other family members, trying to find out what they were like, how they were, trying to find out about the war. So it's helped me in so many ways, and it's helped me pin down those stories and put it on paper. And again, truth is something that's, you know, that's very, very important to me. So the book, the first draft is finally done, and I left it in the living room, and I noticed my mom wanted to read it, and I was a bit uncomfortable, and bless her, I came into the living room and she was holding it onto like this. And it was my little niece, my sister's daughter was there, like, reading it for her, because, and for me, that moment actually, like, just kind of presented the importance of actually doing that book, because, as I said, it wasn't just for me, it was for everyone. So it's been a difficult process. It's still ongoing. The first draft is done. I don't know what's going to happen now. We're going to keep working on it. But again, it was important for me when you've had every aspect of your life controlled by someone else, when you've been dehumanized to such an extent. One of the best ways to counteract that is, again, by having your story heard and having your suffering acknowledged. For me, that was something that's very important. And maybe Hannah, I don't know if you wanted to add something to that, but for me, that was something that was very, very important.
No, I just totally agree.
I think it's a really good time to bring Bill in. Just before I bring you in, Bill, there was just one last question on my list that I don't know if we're going to have time, but it's something maybe we can come back to it during the questions bit. And again, going on from what you were saying, do you think memories of the Kindertransport in Bosnia can work together to raise awareness of genocide and inspire us to act and help those in need today? So I'll leave you with that question. Maybe you can address it during Bill's bit or slightly a little bit later. But yeah, Bill, thanks ever so much for coming in and talking about conciliation. Before you do, we just spoke about this as everybody was joining the talk. Actually, I wondered if you could quickly mention the significance of today, not only that we're hearing from all you wonderful speakers, but what this, you know, the fact that this talk is today.
Today being the 20th of July reminds me anyway of the 20th of July 1944, which was the day on which Stauffenberg tried to blow up Hitler. Sorry, I just shut the window, sorry. So it's a day when in Germany resistance is commemorated. And for a long time it was the resistance of people in the military, or in the case of the GDR, the communists. But over the last 10, 20 years, the resistance of individual Germans to the Nazis, and that includes helping Jews, and it also includes the Kindertransporters, as we saw recently on the BBC programme, has come more into the foreground. So, and I think when we're talking about these acts of perpetration, we should also perhaps always try to remember there are those who resisted them, and their courage and their determination. What I wrote here, I think I should probably have to, in a way, almost want to rewrite it after having heard Hanna and Smajo, but because of the issue, particularly the issue of conciliation, which I think is quite a complex issue. I was reminded that when Hanna was talking about this issue of personal conciliation, particularly, and a very, very clear example of that, apart from what Hanna related, came in 2015 during an Auschwitz trial in Lüneburg, when Eva Kohr, an Auschwitz survivor, famously went up to the defendant, Oskar Gröning, and shook his hand. And this caused quite a lot of discussion at the time. Before the trial, she was on record as having said, "I've suffered most of my life, first under the Nazis, then under my hatred for the Nazis." It might have been less easy for her to have forgiven Gröning had he been directly involved in killing at Auschwitz rather than been part of the overall machinery. And also if he'd not been a campaigner against Holocaust denial, which he was. But then again, she's also on record as having said, "I forgive all Nazis and there's nothing they can do about it." The court sentenced Gröning, though, for his role at Auschwitz. He died not long after. He wasn't able to carry out, they weren't able to carry out the sentence, but it shows the difference. It's not the job of a legal court to forgive or not forgive, but to assess and measure guilt according to the law. Only individuals can offer forgiveness at that level. There are more informal courts, such as the Gacaca courts in Rwanda, who experimented with conciliatory as well as punitive measures, but the results were controversial. Still, without justice, conciliation as a social process might not be possible. Belated justice in the case of Holocaust, the Holocaust can bring a sense of closure, or at least the redressing of crimes. But in the case of Bosnia, and this is what I really struck me when Smajo was talking, I can see the difference. I mean, justice has been delayed here too. But when justice has been reached, I wonder if it might also have a more existential function. And I was reading about a guy called Semzo Osmanovic, I'm sorry if the pronunciation not very good, who lost 23 family members in the Srebrenica massacre. And when the appeal by Ratko Mladic against the 2000 conviction for genocide was rejected last month, Osmanovic told the BBC, "I was living the whole of my life for this moment, to see justice being done by the court and hoping to bring my children and my wife back to Srebrenica," he said. "That's the place where I was born." And I was thinking when Smajo was talking that the issue of justice is all that more important, because you still need you're still living amongst perpetrators. That wasn't the case after 1945, where most of the Jews, of course, had left Germany, apart from a small minority. But in Bosnia, that's not the case. You've still got the perpetrators living with the victims and the families of victims almost side by side. And the importance of justice in that context, I think, is enormous, absolutely enormous. And at least in the case of Osmanovic, he had the feeling that rejection of the appeal was a message that he could take back with him to Srebrenica. So the other thing about reconciliation is his relationship to truth, I think, and this also struck me when both Hanna and Smajo were talking the importance of truth, that without truth, there can be no conciliation. Truth doesn't just mean the facts, it means above all admitting to them. It means taking responsibility, regretting, apologizing. Lying, denial, evasion, blindness, passing on blame cannot lead to conciliation. The return of Jews to Germany after 1990 is unthinkable without Germany's openness to truth, symbolized by the Holocaust Memorial standing at the center of Berlin. And social conciliation between different ethnic and religious groups, and this also particularly applies, I think, to the former Yugoslavia, needs to build on truth. And there can be truth, and it has to be admitted to on both sides. And I'm wondering too if the problem at the moment still in Yugoslavia is nationalism and the kind of Croatian fascism that Smajo referred to, that as long as there are these competing nationalisms, you will have distortion of history. You'll have people taking history on their side, trying to make it a weapon, weaponizing it against those they don't like and those they want to exclude. And that's perhaps slightly different to the case in Germany, where I think guilt has been generally recognized. And we're talking about the burden of shame on later generations rather than the actual active role, continuing active role of the perpetrators. And just finally, and maybe leading into asking Smajo and Hanna one or two things, that conciliation needs symbols, it needs cultural symbols. And also I was thinking, for instance, of the Church of Our Lady in Dresden, which its rebuilding was a symbol of conciliation between Germany and Britain, Dresden and Coventry after the bombing war. And the famous Bridge of Mostar has also become a symbol of conciliation, although I do wonder if the reality on either side of it may be a bit different. So do such symbols mean anything, or do they become meaningless in the context of reality, for instance, in Mostar at the moment? Are they illusions? Do they lead to false hopes? And what about individual artworks? We know that they're important for conciliation too, particularly the example of the Kindertransport keepsakes project, which has been undertaken by Amy and Caroline. And this is also a project to which Hanna and Smajo have contributed in what we'll hear in a moment. So I suppose I wanted to ask Hanna and Smajo, first of all, well, if I could maybe start with Smajo, do you see any hope of conciliation between the different groups in Bosnia?
I'm always hopeful, because I always think, and this is how I've been brought up, that there are more good people in this world than bad people. And the bridge in Mostar, I think the symbolism of the bridge connecting two warring sides is often used, but unfortunately, it is more of a symbol that's been kind of imposed onto Bosnia by the international community. In reality, it actually connected to Bosnian sides during the war. The Croatian side was slightly, so the narrative was kind of almost, and I think a lot of Bosnians have been frustrated with some of the kind of international efforts, which kind of focus on symbolism. And I feel like in Bosnia, people want those tangible efforts. They want those tangible things, because one of the things that I'm looking at in my research in Bosnia, where I'm from in this region, we had a system called, it was like a godparent, godfamily system called the Kum system, where my family, our Kums, our god families, always had to be of a different religion. So my family was Muslim, so our Kum families were always Christians. And for me, that implies that we weren't all the same, but it implies actually that we've recognized those differences, we've respected those differences, we valued those differences. And that's a society we had in Bosnia and that we lived in. And then, so the symbolism sometimes doesn't help. And I think people want more of those tangible efforts to bring people together, to make somehow to bring. So I am hopeful that things will change in the future. I'm not sure when that will be. We did have, or there was efforts, and actually a chap from Durham, or from Sunderland, actually in the northeast of England, he was tasked with setting up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Bosnia. And he said he was very close to actually doing that. And one of the reasons it didn't work is because of the international community. He spent more than 20 years in Bosnia, dedicated so many years of his life, and he blames the international community. But as I said, I'm still hopeful, but we are crippled by an incredibly difficult and complex political system and system of governance through the Dayton Peace Agreement, and we are crippled by nationalism. We have nationalist parties. It's the same parties that were around in the 90s. They're all best of friends, but they're constantly doing everything that they can to keep that wedge between people. But saying all that, I'm still hopeful.
I mean, especially as you talk about the fact that, you know, in the past there were these cultural, there weren't these tensions. I mean, and you know, even though you were Muslims, you had these contact to other religions, and on the other way around as well, that there were bonds between the religions. So maybe that's something that can give reason for hope, that if they were there in the past, they can't be completely destroyed. I mean, they had to suffer communism long enough, and then they emerged, and within no time at all, they were smashed again. So hopefully they can reignite. And maybe I just wanted to ask one last thing, which was a question of time, and for both Hanna and particularly Hanna. What do you think, Hanna, makes conciliation possible, though? I mean, what was it for you particularly? I mean, you mentioned going back to Germany and meeting these Germans who were the second and third generation, and that was a key for you.
You know, I see the reconciliation. There are the public symbols, the big events, but in the end, the true reconciliation is really in the hearts, whether it's in the community that sees the events or the personal exchanges. And, you know, for real reconciliation to take place, both parties, the victimizer and the victim, have to face what actually happened, to tell the truth. And you can forgive the perpetrator for release for yourself, but that doesn't really bear full fruit unless both parties come together. And, you know, I'm seeing Smajo's experience in Bosnia in a worldwide setting. You asked him, you know, if he was hopeful. You know, I do see what we're talking about as desperately important, as a warning, because I think nationalism is rising. You know, Bosnia is also in this setting where there are nationalistic tendencies, even back in Germany, also in America. And, you know, the far right and the victimizing of others, putting them far distant from you, goes on even in Britain. I mean, it's like this whole spirit of fascism is getting stronger. So I just feel very strongly to talk about this.
Smajo, I don't know if you want, if we still got time briefly for Smajo to speak to that, to conciliation, what it might mean for you, or what makes it possible, I suppose.
Again, there are four better, sorry, I'm just going to close the door. There are 4 more qualified people to answer that, and especially people that live there. But I will try. There was well, one of my friends, she's actually she's here and she's just left a comment in the chat, which I think covers it really, really well, and explains the situation in Bosnia at the moment. And without the acceptance of truth and without the acceptance of what happened in Bosnia, how can you build a better and brighter future? It's impossible for that to happen. But I think if everyone looks in the chat, and rather than me describing it, I think Azra covers it really well.
Thanks. Is it back to Chad or Amy? I'm not quite sure what we're...
Yeah, I think now would be a good moment to bring in Caroline to talk about her work with Hanna and Smajo and kind of the wider project that she's been working on with Amy as well. Over to you, Caroline.
Okay, thank you everyone. So Claire is going to be my assistant, hopefully, and share my screen. So with time, I'll be talking about this new project just started. Okay, so you leave that on for a bit, if that's okay then, Claire. So when starting a new project, a creative project in collaboration, and in this case with Hanna and Smajo, my most important role at the start is to listen, and obviously a privilege and a pleasure, an emotional time as well to hear them getting to know each other, talking about shared threads of their stories, which came up with the title Threads of Their Stories. You know, we've already heard they've asked each other questions, they've learned from each other. So it was a time for me to listen, to take notes. So we've done this obviously over Zoom. So after the first Zoom, I started to think of ideas of how I could respond creatively and get in so much of their stories. So I came back to them with a second Zoom with my ideas, and there was gaps for me, there was further questions, so there was prompts to finding more points in their stories, and seeing, you know, if they had more photographs, obviously the mention of documents already. And I myself was already learning so much from both of them. And we've already said in our last Zoom that, you know, we've started with a series, but this could be very developed into a book maybe. And we want to continue, put more themes in, and eventually it could be used maybe in educational and community settings in the future if we can find funding. So I felt creating a series of paired digital collages was the best way forward. It was easy to edit, get feedback from them, and also means that we could slip in other themes as we go along in the future. So the best way forward to share their stories is obviously visually. So visual storytelling can help make a complex and nuanced stories easier for an audience to understand and deliver an impactful message. A different way to tell a story may be accessible to more people, especially students we were thinking of, and it can teach a valuable lesson. And it can resonate, you know, you bring your own personal experience, your own story when you're listening to other stories. You know, we're all storytellers. And for me, using sort of the visual images, younger people can connect. It perhaps focuses their attention to the messages that people can take and learn from beyond the storytelling experience itself. In using the power of visual images, it can also help to evoke emotions, to narrate a story across diverse cultures we've already heard, and preserving it for future generations, you know, as well as obviously the books that they've written and are writing. The visual narrative tells many different stories at the same time, as it can mix and combine multiple images and layers. But having spent so much time listening, and obviously we were all taking so many points already from Hanna and Smajo, I decided to support this with dialogue from our conversations and asked for certain comments for certain themes. So by combining the visual and narrative, hopefully making for a full experience for the viewer and the listener. As I said, I initially thought of 5 themes, but we've gone up to 8 themes. And the themes are home, torn from home, life in a new country, memories, retracing steps, stones for remembrance, faith, and why I speak, obviously overlapping with some that we've heard, because obviously this is the nature of sharing stories. And so just briefly, the materials and techniques I used. My background's in embroidered textiles, and in Hannah's book and in Times We Spoke, there were many references to the fabric of her life. You know, she talks about threads unraveling and the golden thread. I've used some parts of some of Hannah's own collage work that she talks about, that helped her really in a way, she said, before she wrote her book, to sort of visualize and deal with things. So one piece is called The Golden Thread. So I researched German and Bosnian textiles and actually found a Bosnian stitch. So if you can see the opening intro, it's a diagonal stitch and you can do patterns with it. So that's sort of the threads that are connecting them both on top of each other. And there seemed to be a predominance for blue as well in both of the sort of cultures. So use that as a colour, one of the main colours. So I made the textile, as you can see, as the background piece to connect them. And as you see, when we move on in a minute, the pieces in the headings, I used traditional symbols, but also symbols that were relevant to their stories, you know, particularly the key, which Smajo's mentioned, and we'll come back to that later, you know, the heart, birds, and there's a dog in Smajo's story that I haven't even got into what I've done yet. So there's things that can be delved in. You won't get everything in the first looking at it or going about it. Besides doing some art, the photos they were sharing featured strongly, as I could see how precious photos were to both of them, and the power of having photos of loved ones, photos of loved ones who'd been murdered, but then the pain of not having photos of some of their loved ones. I know Smajo talks about taking one album with them when they had to leave their home. And with everyone, we've all got photos, even if it's on your phone today, we all can appreciate that these snapshots of the family, you know, they're frozen moments in time, precious moments. I've also used maps to give a sense of place to represent their stories geographically, and these are all informed the colour palette. So Claire, if you don't mind moving to the next slide, thank you. So as you say, I've done them so they can be seen as pairs, but if you maybe want to move on so we can see them individually just while we're talking about them, so if you, thank you. So from conversations with Hanna and the conversations I've had in the past, you know, very much your name, your identity, all these different names, you know, her given name at birth, you know, the name that her parents used, the name the people in the village used, you know, a sense of place. And these precious photos, so obviously Hanna herself on the luggage label, symbol, obviously symbolic, I use that throughout as well. The left-hand corner, Hanna with her mother, and on the right, I believe the only photograph of her father, and he's on the far right. So again, this is a sense of identity, the community he lived with. And I decided to leave the top quite open because in some of them, there's very intense, this idea of those images of people she hasn't got. Again, I'm conscious of time, so I think we should move on. So if we do Smajo's home, thank you. Again, slightly different because obviously we know Hanna was alone once she left, but Smajo was with family more, obviously be able to take more pictures when he was his age than obviously you would do in the 1930s anyway. But again, this idea of these photos were taken, you know, as their identity. So I tried to change them by, you know, drawing them to this idea of how important family were. I wanted to get over, and obviously again, the map again, you know, there's this idea of not everyone knows where Bosnia and Herzegovina is perhaps. Again, so if we move on, thank you, to the second pair. So again, you know, moving on rapidly in their stories. So torn from home. So again, I wanted to give Hanna a lot of space in this image because she talks very much about her journey, you know, being put on the train, then on her own. And we can see the bottom right-hand corner. This is the collage with the golden thread where she felt very alone. You know, the Kindertransport label, her documents. And then I drew in train tracks very much on the horizons and never going to be ending. You know, we know her first journey to the UK isn't going to be her last journey. Again, if you want to move on, so just conscious of time. Again, things that Smajo has already referenced, you know, the description of having to leave, you know, their newly built home, their neighbours watching, their neighbours were their friends, not, you know, everyone, but the fact they were marched out, people we knew. He's mentioned they are the perpetrators, you know, having to live back with the perpetrators. A document of the list of, you know, the signature number 13 with his mum having to give up these items for safekeeping, which we know they never got back. If we move on to the third pair, thank you. The life in a new country, if you want to do Hanna's first, thank you. So again, you know, lots of testimony from Hanna here and the idea, the juxtaposition of that bottom left-hand school photograph of happy memories. And Hanna talks about that they weren't happy memories, you know, and until later on, she talks about, you know, closing her heart to the bigger hurt. And then smaller instances, there's a story about a doll that, you know, you could tell students, you know, the first people she lived with and it not working out. So again, this idea of her journey just starting, and again, identity is now a number at the moment. If we move on to Smajo's. So again, different, his journey is obviously less on his own, but obviously there's still the worry of his father, as he's told us, isn't with him. But again, this idea of coming to this community, being welcomed, you know, meeting up again, starting school with his brother in the bottom left-hand corner. You know, he talked about feeling part of this community, his Bosnian and his Geordie, you know, so this idea, I think, students to take, that we can all be different and respect our differences, and the fact we're free to be different. If you want to move on to, I think, number 4. So memories, yeah. So with previous conversation, the other project with Hanna, we talked about any precious objects she may have had, and suddenly remembered these scissors, and then went off and wrote a poem. And, you know, this idea of that last physical contact, that these were the scissors that her mother had used, you know, that intimate moment between a mother and a child. And I'll just give you a minute maybe to read the poem for yourself. Okay, sorry, at the bottom of this, sorry, just, yeah, the bottom of the picture again is part of a collage when Hanna was doing a series of collages, sort of working through her experiences, and, you know, the forget-me-nots, the flowers, it all features later, and her book's called A Garland of Ashes, the symbolism of flowers. Thank you. And then this lovely start of a memory of Smajo. And again, we've all got memories of special times with our parents, whether it was, you know, having a special meal at the weekend or being brought something. So, you know, if young people to relate to Nutella, you know, this story of, you know, being brought home, but then as war starts, it's not Nutella that they bring home, it's bullets. But this normality of being able to, you know, still collect them, trying to normalize the terrible experience they're having, you know, kept them children, you know, try to remain this idea of, I think they both mentioned, of being dehumanized, not being dehumanized, but remaining human. If you want to move on to the next pair. Okay, so retracing steps, which obviously both of them have spoken about. So with this one of Hanna's, obviously she's had more of a journey and longer, and Smajo is still, like you say, at certain stages. So the left-hand side is dealing with retracing her parents' steps, you know, that she said, going back to Poland, the first time she sees their signatures in the book at the Radziecka near Lodz Ghetto for deportation. And, you know, and that ignites the love in her shrunken heart. So we're coming, as she's mentioned before, you know, full circle. She closed her heart off to her parents, but all this retracing her step is opening back up. Just conscious of time, I'm right for a few more minutes. Yeah. Again, and Smajo talks about, you know, he tells us about leaving the home with the key still they've got, but the first time they were allowed to go back as a family. And of all the photos he sent me, and how important, you know, he's talked about his mum and grandparents and how people have helped, you know, him not to hate. And just, you know, the look on her face that going back to her, that was her bedroom in their dream family home. To more recently, he's mentioned, you know, going back, taking study groups, you know, and to places that I've been to as well. So the personal connection of experiencing, going to places where, you know, sites actually happened, these events. And if you want to move on to Stones for Remembrance. So again, you know, very personal connection for me being Jewish, the idea of using stones, you know, to honour, to remember as part of the burial, the funeral. Again, I'll just let you read Hannah's powerful words there. No, it's fine, whiz through. But again, just the Stoppel stone, she finally is getting recognition. And again, the story that totally moved me about hope, and the cousin that Liko, if that's how you pronounce his name, sorry if it's not, mentioned, you know, this idea of having hope and the importance of this rock that he wrote their names on, and obviously the memorial to the 8,372, you know, people are still waiting to be found, you know, as Smajo said, there's mothers that have passed away and haven't had that funeral, haven't had that chance to say goodbye. And if we move on to faith. So again, very important in Hannah's life, and again, moved on quickly to her sort of getting married to George, the final change of her name, and she says the beginning of their faith journey together. And she's mentioned this tree. So again, these are things I'll share that people could look at later if they like. and her memories of visiting Bosnia. No, that's fine. And if we move on to Smajo's, again, just representing the faith that Smajo talked about. He's already mentioned the cum system, but again, the aunt that was so fondly, Amina talks about the way his grandparents and mum and helped him to deal with it, not to have revenge, but to seek justice. And if we just go to the last 2 slides, yeah, why I speak, obviously very important, and they've both spoken about this. And just the image of Hanna back with a memorial from where she left back in Germany, you know, this idea of going full circle. It's taken her years of silence, but now she feels she can speak about it, and obviously to honour people, to remember, and her book there. And the same if we move on to Smajo. Again, all those symbolic things that he's mentioned in his story, you know, his aunt empowering him to talk as well, that book he kept, you know, about his hopes and dreams for the future. And now he does go back, and he is sharing his story here and back in Bosnia. And I'm very looking forward to reading his book when he finishes the final draft. And just to say thank you to both of them. They've been so open and generous, and we've had happy moments and emotional moments, and I look forward to hopefully continuing the work. Thank you very much, everyone.
Great. Thank you for sharing about the project, Caroline, that came out from the our conversations around and with Smajo and Hanna. I'd like to pick up a thread from the chat and also from earlier that that was touched on, which I think will cover quite a few things that are in the chat, hopefully, but really focusing on Smajo and Hanna. Do you think that memories of the Kindertransport and the Bosnian genocide can work together to raise awareness of genocide and inspire us to act to help those in need today? And there is discussion in the chat around these ideas of conciliation and reconciliation as well, and perhaps differences between that. But I wondered if you could both speak to that, please.
I feel so very strongly the power of bringing these two historical events and bringing actual people who experience them as children together. I think for the people who are part of it, the children who are adults now, you know, it fulfills an enormous function because it lifts us out of our personal victimhood. It gives us other people to relate to and encourages us. You know, Smajo talked about hopeful, being hope. That's a big part of his story. And, you know, that affects me personally. It gives me hope. But I think coming together, it strengthens the message of acceptance of different people, you know, inclusivity, but it also gives a stronger clarion call to speak up. You know, the fact that Smajo is speaking up and the fact that I'm speaking up, I hope we encourage others to speak up about injustice. So the combination strengthens the message.
I don't think I've got much more to add to that, if I'm being honest. I think Hanna summed it up really well there. I think just one quick comment. I think focusing on our commonalities and our shared experience, and again, something that I talk about in my talks is you don't have to have been a refugee to experience some of the emotions that I've experienced. You know, the trauma of exclusion or anxiety, the pressures of life and so on. We experience all those things in everyday lives, but by by being part of each other's lives, by sharing and looking at those commonalities, looking at the things that unites us. For me, that's what my work is about. And my book is about peace, essentially, and it is about hope and how do we build peace. And for me, an event like this is peacemaking. That's what it is for me. And that's why I think this connection, I personally would love to carry on exploring further, because I feel like this is something that hasn't been explored before, but I think it can also touch upon so many different things with the rising anti-Semitism that we have in this country and across Europe, and anti-refugee sentiment and Islamophobia and so on. I mean, I feel like with these stories, we can tackle so many different things, and having someone like Hanna and all her energy to share her story, it's like, for me, I just think it's so incredible, and I want to learn more, and I just want to carry on working on this.
Thank you both for those really fascinating reflections on the importance of conversation and the importance of dialogue. And thank you both as well for sharing your stories this evening in a relatively, very short period of time, and for sharing so many fascinating details with us this evening. And I can see that lots more are being picked up in the chat as well. And I agree that I think it would be great at perhaps another opportunity to come back together and to explore some of those themes that are discussed in the chat. But I wondered if, as we kind of come to the close this evening, and I think you probably all feel like me that this has been a really invigorating evening, and the time has just flown by. So thanks for all the contributors for such a stimulating conversation this evening. I wanted to ask if any of you had any final thoughts to leave us with.
It's just on my heart to just to say thank you to Caroline, because she's played a big part in Smajo and I going deeper. And visually, this is a very significant way of telling the story of forgiveness, reconciliation.
Oh, thank you, Hanna. So I'd like to finish then by thanking the Parks Institute for hosting this evening's event, thanking Hanna, Smajo, Bill, and Caroline for talking this evening, and to thank Amy for co-hosting. Thank you all for joining, and I can see there's lots of fascinating comments in the chat as well, that hopefully we'll be able to pick up at another point in the future as well. But thank you all for joining in and for coming along this evening.
Thank you so much, Chad. And all of you, Smajo, Hanna, for such thoughtful reflections. And everything we've discussed tonight is so important and so dear to the Parks Institute and what we do, and our research on Jewish, non-Jewish relations, and for more tolerance and more understanding of each other. So thank you very much. It was our last Parks Research Seminar of the year, so we'll see you all back in the autumn, I hope, and have a lovely summer.